Now, these awakening groups are paid by the U.S. military and operate in much of the country, and they employ former fighters and are empowering them. And this is much to the consternation of the Shia-dominated government as well as the Shia militias, who thought that they had defeated the Sunnis just to see the Americans let them come into Baghdad through the back door. So although militias were the main problem in Iraq, we've just created new ones. American soldiers, officers call this the Iraqi solutions for Iraqi problems. But it's really quite a very frightening scenario when you have more militias in a country that's been terrorized by militias. Now, by accepting money from the Americans, the Sunni militiamen have rid themselves, from their point of view, of an onerous American presence. The Americans think they've purchased Sunni loyalty, but the Sunnis think that they've purchased American loyalty. They think they've gotten the Americans off of their back for a little while so they can rebuild their power, rebuild their strength, and eventually take on the Shias once again. And they're very open about this when you talk to them. Now, in both cases, Sunni and Shia militias, the militiamen are chafing under the restrictions placed on them. The Mahdi army fighters are losing power on the street. They're no longer out there with their guns. Either the Americans are there or awakening groups are there. Crime is increasing in these areas because the Mahdi army was preventing some sorts of crimes. And they're very frustrated, and they were for a while, that the Americans are still targeting them, still arresting them, and that the Iraqi army is targeting them. And they're very frustrated with what they see as al-Qaeda guys who were killing us a few months ago now being empowered and paid by the Americans. Many Mahdi army groups, of course, have ignored the ceasefire and are rejecting Muqtada Sadr's commands. They view him as a sellout. He's over there in Iran, living the good life. We're over here. In fact, his followers are much more radical than he is these days. And there have been demonstrations lately in Baghdad where they're chanting that he's basically betrayed them. Now, Sunni militiamen are also very frustrated. The awakening groups, they were promised 20% of them would be integrated into the Iraqi security forces. That's not happening. It's clear that it won't happen. Those who have tried to go, many of them complain that they're treated as suspects, they're harassed, they're abused by the Shia-dominated security forces. And they also complain very often that the Americans are late in paying them. They frequently threaten to quit and protest. They feel very humiliated. They threaten to resume fighting. It's well known that the American military cannot sustain its numbers there in the same levels for very much longer. It's going to be forced to reduce its numbers, and when this occurs, there's going to be increased space for Sunni militias to operate, for Shia militias to operate. They have not abandoned their political goals, their ideological goals. The government of Iraq is dominated by sectarian Shia Islamist parties. They also dominate the security forces, and they often target Sunni civilians for cleansing. The government and the security forces worry about the empowered Sunni militias that they will have to fight one day again. As we saw last week, rival Shia militias are also bitter enemies. And when I was in Baghdad, in Sadr city, there were displaced Iraqis who had moved up from Karbala and from Diwaniyah because their families had been Sadr supporters. And they complained that militias or the security forces loyal to the Supreme Council, the Badr organization, had targeted them. And they distributed videos of children, dead children and dead families, houses that had been burned, etc. And they were very bitter. And they also threatened to resume fighting. Now, it's wrong to view the clashes in Basra last week as between the Mahdi army bad guys and the Iraqi government good guys. They were between rival militias for control over resources, over voters, and the Iraqi security forces themselves are divided in their loyalty. Hence, the Iraqi army units that fought in the south were recruited from the south, and they were loyal to the Supreme Council. Elsewhere, we saw that the Iraqi police units, most of them were loyal to the Mahdi army, refused to fight. And many of the soldiers are also loyal to the Mahdi army. As we saw, were it not for the American military and air force, the Iraqi army could not have stood up to the Mahdi army. And the Mahdi army would have had no reason to sue for peace as it did. Muqtada Sadr's movement is the most popular movement in Iraq today, the most powerful one. The Sadrists are the largest humanitarian organization in Iraq as well. They provide the most aid to the most people. They're supporters mostly, but that's true nevertheless. The one bright spot that you could see in the recent fighting in the south is that this inter-Shia fighting means that there's no longer a united Shia bloc that can purge Sunnis. Now, Badr organization, the Mahdi army, had worked together quite closely in expelling Sunnis from Baghdad and elsewhere and killing them and operating as death squads. That's not going to happen anymore, now that the rivalry between them is so intense, and the hatred between them is intense and it's real. So as a result, we might see cross-sectarian alliances between different militias, Sunni militias allying with Shia militias, such as the Sadrists, when it comes to issues of federalism, when it comes to the elections in the future. And perhaps that means that at least the most frightening scenario of a Sunni-Shia civil war spreading throughout the region is no longer as realistic. Many Americans are unaware, and this hasn't come up in this today's meeting as well, that the American military is not a benign presence in Iraq. While things aren't, the occupation isn't as brutal as it once was, it's still very brutal. And a foreign military occupation is a systematic imposition of violence and terror on an entire people. American soldiers are not in Iraq as peacekeepers or policemen, and they're often not helping the Iraqi people. The numerous and routine raids that Americans engage in terrorize an entire population. I've gone on many of these raids, and I've experienced that terror myself. Tens of thousands of Iraqi men are arrested. The majority of them are innocent. They never charged with anything. They never tried. Their homes are destroyed. Their families traumatized. Children watch their fathers being taken away for a day, for 2 years, and perhaps eventually they're released. At least 24,000 men are still in American-run prisons in Iraq. At least 900 of those are juveniles. Now, even when the Americans hand over a fraction of the Iraqi prisoners to Iraqi authorities, if Iraqi authorities find them innocent, the Americans can still hold them. These are called on-hold cases, and there are 500 cases of Iraqis who are being held by the Americans after they were found innocent of anything, committing any crime by Iraqi authorities. Now, of course, international human rights organizations are loath to make the recommendation that the Americans hand their prisoners over to the Iraqis because it's well known that it's much better to be held by the Americans than to be held by the Iraqis. And I've witnessed a situation where Sunni leaders in an area complain to the American officers in the area, why did you let the Iraqi police arrest them? Why can't you arrest our men? Because at least you know they won't be executed when they're being held in American detention. The conditions in Iraqi prisons are really horrifying. In the women's prison in Kazmia, female prisoners are routinely raped by their Iraqi prison guards. And conditions in Iraqi prisons got much worse during the surge because the Iraqi system couldn't cope with the massive influx of prisoners. Now, I visited, while I was there, numerous Iraqi ministries and government offices. This was the Muharram month, the Shia holy month, during which the Ashura celebrations or ceremonies are held. In all the government buildings I visited, there were Shia religious banners on all the walls, Shia flags on top of the buildings, radios and television stations inside these government buildings were tuned in to Ashura ceremonies, to Karbala. And this creates the impression among Sunnis that there's a Shia ownership of the government. And Sunnis who feel that they're excluded and unwanted, which is true, this sort of reinforces that. But in truth, the government is irrelevant anyway. It provides no services, not even the fundamental monopoly on the use of violence. So the focus we have here on the government, on laws being passed, it's a distraction because power is really in the hands of militias on the street. And these militias are very small, local neighborhood militias. Sometimes they're formed from local soccer leagues, local gangs from before the war where the gang leaders became Mahdi army leaders or resistance leaders. I met Iraqi national police officers while I was in Baghdad who complained to me that all of their men were loyal to the Mahdi army and that many of their commanders were loyal to the Badr organization. And if they were suspected of disloyalty, then their own men would turn them into Shia militias. And Mahdi army commanders had come into police stations and threatened Shia police officers who were suspected of not being sufficiently loyal to the Mahdi army. I was actually in the neighborhood of Washash, which is close to the Mansour neighborhood. It's a Shia slum adjacent to the rich Mansour neighborhood. And I was filming over there for a documentary, and it's controlled by the Mahdi army, by sort of a rogue Mahdi army group that's disliked by other members of the Mahdi army. And they were complaining to me about how the Iraqi army abuses them and is sectarian in their area. And as I was filming, the Iraqi army came in because they were upset that there was a journalist there. So the Mahdi army men said, don't worry, we'll smuggle you out through the back. We'll take you to the Iraqi police. And behind one of the concrete blast walls, there were a couple of Iraqi national police vehicles. And the men said, don't worry, these guys are with us. The Iraqi police were with the Mahdi army. So I was handed by the Mahdi army to Iraqi police to protect me from the Iraqi army. And this sort of stuff is quite common.